John Blundell. I asked him beforehand, how did he come to write a book on Ladies for Liberty? And he says, well, you'll have to wait for the speech. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce John Blundell. He's a freelance lecturer and writer and consultant to free market foundations and think tanks. And of course, the epitome of think tanks is the one, is the Nassau Institute. So anyway, he has served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Humane Society Studies at George Mason University, the Atlas Foundation, the Koch Foundation, and the Institute of Economic Affairs in London from 1993 through 2009. Among the many papers and articles he is author of Waging the War of Ideas, Margaret Thatcher, a portrait of the Iron Lady, and Ladies for Liberty, Women Who Made a Difference in American Society, American History. As we discussed before the meeting, he lives in Florida. His interest includes genealogy, heraldry, sports statistics, and Morgan cars. I'm a Ford man, but anyway, it was great pleasure to introduce John Blundell.
Thank you, Ralph. It's always a great honour to be introduced by a former student of Milton Friedman's. I'm a great admirer of Milton. In fact, his wife Rose appears in my book, the chapter of her own. So thank you for that. I must say that I was a bit mystified when you asked me to speak about my latest book, Ladies for Liberty, about my 20 or so favourite women in American history. Because my previous book was a biography of Margaret Thatcher. And I thought to myself, surely they're going to want my Margaret Thatcher speech, not Ladies for Liberty. And it was a bit of a mystery to me until about 3 o'clock this afternoon, when I sat down with one of the editorial writers at the Tribune. And he knew exactly why you had invited me to speak on Ladies for Liberty. And we talked for 2 hours about the role and the legal position of women in your society. And he was rather hoping to join us this evening. I see he's not here. And he gave me quite a briefing. We had quite a discussion for 2 hours. And I hope that he'll be writing an appropriate column before too long, reflecting our discussion. So how did I come to write this book? As Ralph said, I promised to explain this to you. Well, about 7 years ago now, I was speaking for the Heritage Foundation in Colorado Springs at its resource bank. They asked me to speak about Margaret Thatcher, and they asked Attorney General Nice, Ed Nice, to speak about Ronald Reagan. And we did after dinner a double act. And the response to that speech was so overwhelming, overwhelmingly positive, that I sat down and wrote Margaret Thatcher, a portrait of the Iron Lady, this book, to explain Margaret and her ideas and her actions to Americans, more generally to a foreign audience. In fact, the book came out here in the United States and has since come out in Polish, Romanian and Chinese. So I'm becoming quite well known. And as I say, the biography is directed not at British people, but at non-British people. And this led to more speaking engagements around the United States, and I'm still doing them. In fact, I've had several engagements where I was meant to speak about Ladies for Liberty, and suddenly they changed it to Margaret Thatcher because of the movie. And of course, Meryl Streep last February winning Best Actress Award for her role as Margaret in The Iron Lady in the movie. And if you want to ask me questions later about that, I'm happy to answer them, because I have blogged on that issue of was it a good portrayal. But at all of these engagements around the United States, I get into a discussion about great women in American history. And I'd come home struck by how many of the women in American history that I admired and admired for many years were just not known by the audiences. I mean, everybody knew Martha Washington or Abigail Adams. We were just talking about Abigail Adams only moments ago, or Ayn Rand or Harriet Beecher Stowe. But after that, name recognition just plummeted. Well, I think, judging by the age of most people in this room, you probably all know how respectful Pamela accepted. You all know how respectful teenagers can be to their parents. And one evening in Port Charlotte, Florida, I was getting a Chinese takeout with my youngest son, then about 19, and I was going on and on about these terrible audiences that knew nothing about American history. And my then 19-year-old James turned to me and he said, "For heaven's sakes, Dad, shut up, stop moaning, and just write a book about all these women." And it was like a light bulb went off. And I did. And here it is, Ladies for Liberty, women who made a difference in American history. And I've already signed a few copies, and there's still some copies left. It was just published late 2011, and if you go to YouTube and put in the title Ladies for Liberty and John Stossel, not John Blundell, John Stossel by Alan Fox, you'll see me being interrogated by John Stossel about the book. And a second expanded edition with 5 new chapters is coming out later this year. So how did I select these women? Well, first of all, they had to be dead. Or as the lady said to me the other day in Indianapolis, Indiana, she said, "John, don't say dead. Say their contribution had to be complete." No more surprises. Second, they had to be principled and pro-liberty. Thirdly, there had to be some really major long-run achievement in their life. I admire Betty Zane, I admire Molly Pitcher, but they were famous for 15 minutes, and that was about that. There was nothing to compare to, say, Cady Stanton's 60 years of fighting for women's rights. I wanted a wide range of really good stories, and there had to be as little overlap as possible. So not endless, Western novelists or abolitionists or suffragettes or what have you. Each story had to be different. So let me now just briefly say a couple of sentences about each of the ladies, and I'll take them in the order they're in the book, which is in fact chronological by date of birth. I start with Mercy Otis Warren, who became known as the conscience of the American Revolution, and she was clearly by far the most important woman in the revolutionary era. Yet only about 1% of Americans know her name. She basically, she did a lot of things. I think probably the single most important thing she did was to invent the email of that era. And it wasn't email, of course, it wasn't anything like it, but it was the committees of correspondence that were set up throughout the 13 colonies and which kept the patriots in touch with each other. And that was an idea hatched by her and her husband and a couple of friends in her front room, and implemented and was strategically vital. She also wrote lots of poems and plays, published under a pseudonym, because of course women weren't expected to write plays and poems back then. She was the first woman to write a history of the United States. She advised 4 out of the first 6 presidents, and she influenced the Bill of Rights. Second, Martha Washington. Martha Washington is probably the least educated lady in my book, by quite a long chalk. But she did one thing, and if it hadn't been for that one thing, the Revolutionary War would have gone the other way. And that was every fall she travelled, and it often took 2 to 3 weeks, from their home in Virginia to wherever his winter camp was, and kept him there, kept him happy, kept him protected from the legions of visitors that were coming and pestering him. And if she hadn't done that, he would have probably come home. If he'd gone home, his officers would have gone home, and the men would have all gone, and the next spring would have rolled around, and the Brits would have just rolled over them. So it was pivotal that she did that. Abigail Adams, well, she did everything. She married a future president. She gave birth to a future president, and only Mrs. Bush has copied that 200 or so years later. She took her son to watch the Battle of Bunker Hill, which, although it was supposedly a British victory, it came at huge cost The Brits were known as lobsterbacks because of their red uniforms, like lobsters. And for every dead American patriot, there was something like 4 or 5 dead lobsterbacks. So although they won, it really was an American victory. She melted her pots and pans, turned them into bullets. She let the militia train on her land. She educated black people when it was illegal. The list just goes on and on. She advised her husband endlessly in countless numbers, I mean literally thousands of letters that she wrote to her husband. And she never owned a slave. Not anything to do with economics, out of deliberate choice. She never owned a slave. Which is very rare for that sort of person in that sort of time. The Grimke sisters, they were Southern royalty in Charleston, South Carolina. I mean, they had everything. Their family tree on both sides is just full of generals and governors and people that came over on those first boats, and I mean, just incredible how well they were connected and how much money they had. And they gave it all up. They hated slavery. And they moved north, first to Philadelphia, then to New York, then to Boston, and became probably the most brilliant strategic campaigners for abolition that ever existed. And a lot of my book actually is to do with strategy for change. And I do admire the Grimke sisters. I was in Charleston, South Carolina not long ago. There is virtually impossible to find any record or any sign that they ever lived there. I did eventually, through the local historical society, find a lady who told me which house they grew up in, but it's a house that's now famous because a president stayed there for a week. I can't even remember which president it was. The fact that the Grimke sisters were born there and lived there till they were in their 20s, it is pretty much ignored still today in South Carolina. Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a freed northern slave who campaigned for decades from Boston in the east across to Michigan for abolition. And she was, I was about to say of course because most blacks then would have been illiterate. She was illiterate, but she dictated her autobiography to an amanuensis who wrote it down for her. And so she had her autobiography, she had a signed photograph of herself, and she had a hymn sheet. And she travelled right across America with two donkeys pulling a little cart, and she'd pull into a crossroads, get on the back of the cart, belt out some of her songs. People would come from the fields and the villages to hear her, and she'd give them her anti-slavery message, and finance her way by selling her little book and her photo and her song sheet. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a great woman who wrote the Seneca Falls Declaration. And if you've never read it, I suggest you do. It's one of the greatest bits of political writing I've ever read. And for 50 years she was absolutely plumb line on all women's issues, totally principled and intractable. And her big buddy, of course, was Susan B. Anthony, who's now much more famous, probably because she outlived Cady Stanton and maybe had more relatives to assure her of her place in history. And when I had to choose between which of the two, because their lives were so intertwined, I couldn't do both, I chose Cady Stanton as a way of trying to re-establish her place in history. A bit of trivia: when Susan B. Anthony died 4 years after Cady Stanton, she was buried with her favourite bit of jewellery. And her favourite bit of jewellery was a representation of the flag of the United States. So it had the 13 stripes with 13 colonies, but when it came to the number of stars, her bit of jewellery had only 4 stars. Who can tell me why would Susan B. Anthony have only 4? This is around about 1905. Why would there be only 4 stars on that bit of jewellery buried as Susan B. Anthony?
States where it was illegal.
It was
illegal to have slaves.
No, 4 states.
No, this is 1905.
Stuart.
No, it's way too. I mean, the emancipation was 1863. This is
12.
You're on the right track, though.
They weren't anti-drinking, were they?
No, it wasn't temperance. It was the 4 states that allowed women to vote.
Oh, okay.
Because before the 19th Amendment passed after World War I, some states did allow women to vote. They were all out of the West, Utah, Wyoming, places like that, and that was Susan's jewellery. Harriet Tubman. She escaped from slavery, got north, and ran the Underground Railroad for many years. Her train never left the tracks, and she never lost a passenger. Estimates vary. The lowest I found was about 120, the highest was more like 500, being the number of people that she helped escape. She later became a spy, a military leader, and a social worker. She's quite a character, Harriet Tubman. And of course, when she got going, she only had to get the escaped slaves up to Pennsylvania. But then the Refugee Slave Act was passed, and she had to get them up to Canada before they were free, which caused us some issues. She would go down from Pennsylvania, where she worked for about 10 months a year as a cook or a maid or whatever, and raise the money so she could take a couple of months off. And she'd go down in December and come back in January. And the reason for that was twofold. One was that it was darker, so it was easier to travel at night and not be noticed. And secondly, the slaves were, to the extent they would be auctioned off, it would be between Christmas and New Year's. But if a farmer thought he'd had a bad year, well, by Christmas he would know he'd had a bad year. That wasn't in fact the case. And the easiest asset to sell off would be a slave. And so the slaves got very anxious around about Christmas time. And if they knew that their master had had a bad year, then their propensity to flee with Tubman, of course, went up. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the best-selling books in all of history, second only in that century to the Bible. Lincoln supposedly said on meeting her, "So you're the little lady who caused my great war." People in the South were so outraged by Uncle Tom's Cabin that they were known to chop body parts off their slaves and mail them to her. One of her sisters opened her mail for her after that started. Bina Westmiller, one of my favourite stories. She was a high school teacher in Port Huron, Michigan, and she had 2 pupils of great potential when their mother died. And because the mother died, the father had to put them up for adoption. And they were immediately adopted, one in this town over here, and the girl was sent out to be clean rooms in a rooming hotel kind of place. And the boy was sent out to this town, and he was immediately sent out to clean out stables. So their education was over. And Bina was furious, because if the man had died, there'd been an insurance payout, because all the men were members of a friendly society, a working men's society. But the women didn't have life insurance, and when they died, families, unless the man remarried very quickly, and a few did, just to keep the family together, the result would be breaking up the family. So she popularised, I don't want to say she invented life insurance for women, but she certainly popularised it, and soon had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of women throughout the United States and Canada insured. Madam C.J. Walker. Madam Walker was the first woman in history to make $1 million with her beauty products for black people. Women before her had $1 million, but through a husband or an inheritance or, whatever. Through some government regulation maybe favouring some particular industry. But she was the first woman of any colour to make $1 million. But more importantly, she invented franchising, because she sold her beauty products through a team of something like 8,000 or 9,000 women that she recruited and trained. And part of the training was a training in the principles of free market economics, believe it or not. And those women earned about 6 times what they'd earned previously as maids or cooks or what have you. So she was absolutely terrific. Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane. Rose took her mother's notes and wrote The Little House on the Prairie. Any of you grow up reading those books? Little House on the Prairie? Yeah? Okay, yes, we got two. Even in Uruguay you grew up.
We have the series.
You have to see it. In fact, the
Translated to Spanish.
The TV series was Ronald Reagan's favourite TV programme, and is already slated to still be on TV in America for at least another 12 or 15 years through future contracts to air it. And of course, Rose also wrote her own novels and a very important book, The Discovery of Freedom, Man's Struggle Against Authority. Isabel Paterson made huge contributions through her own novels and through her regular weekly 2,000-word book review column that was read all across America, as well as her classic book, The God of the Machine. But I think more importantly for me, in this book at any rate, she did three things. She educated a young Ayn Rand. She told Ayn Rand to make her novels timeless, with no contemporary references, and in a late-night phone call, she and Rand conceived the central idea for the novel Atlas Shrugged, which you might have noticed the second part of the three-part trilogy has just come out as a movie. Lila Wallace. Lila Acheson Wallace was pivotal in the creation of that great journal of my youth, something I must admit I no longer read, but that great pro-market anti-communist monthly called Reader's Digest. She, forget the content, I mean she was not responsible for the content, but just look at what she did. She raised the venture capital to make it possible in the first place. She came up with all the best marketing ideas that built the subscription. Her husband was often depressed, and she was constantly keeping him from just wrapping up the whole thing. And she later ran the human resources side, because that was her background, human resources. She later ran the human resources side at a very fast-growing company. I think it's quite true to say that without Lila Acheson Wallace, we wouldn't have had Reader's Digest, and that was a pivotal publication in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s.
One of my first books out of school books, the Reader's Digest collection of Maya.
Oh yeah. Oh, and the way they condense the books, and
Yes.
yes, so it's very important. Vivien Kellems, I've only got about 4 or 5 more now. Vivien Kellems, she was a Connecticut manufacturer who objected to withholding on many philosophical fronts. And after World War II, that's where the employer withholds your tax. Up until World War II, employees had to send the tax into the government. So employees knew exactly what they were paying because they had to write the checks. But in World War II, the government introduced withholding, and suddenly employees had no idea what was being paid on their behalf. And that was, and it was introduced as a temporary wartime measure. And Kellems paid it as long as the war was on. Once the war was over, she waited 2 years, and the IRS was very happy with this new arrangement, and she wasn't. And she took them on. It was a bloody battle, and it ended in a tie. Taylor Caldwell was a monumental, important novelist, writing 40 mega bestsellers after World War II. She was the female equivalent of Harold Robbins. Her books were so big that when Hollywood bought the film rights, they couldn't digest them. They couldn't make them into films. And so she forced, it was her novels that led to, I use the word forced, I shouldn't use that word, it was her novels that led to the invention of the TV miniseries. Books that are too big for Hollywood to digest, you make them into a TV miniseries, and that was created by Taylor Caldwell. Well, she didn't create it, but that was what was the impetus behind the idea. But let me just quote you one line from a 1965 novel entitled A Pillar of Iron, which I think is astonishingly relevant for today's political debate in this country and in countries around, certainly around North America and Western Europe. Antonius, this is set in Roman times. Antonius heartily agreed with Cicero that the budget should be balanced, that the treasury should be refilled, that the public debt should be reduced, that the arrogance of the generals should be tempered and controlled, that assistance to foreign lands should be curtailed, lest Rome become bankrupt, that the mobs should be forced to work and not depend on government for subsistence, and that prudence and frugality should be put into practice as soon as possible. That's a line from a novel, 1965, about Rome. And that'll give you a flavour of what Taylor Caldwell was all about. So, what can one say about Clare Booth Luce? She was an editor, a journalist, a war reporter, an intelligence gatherer, a playwright, a movie writer, a congresswoman, the first congresswoman from Connecticut. She advised presidents, and she was the first woman to be appointed a senior diplomat. So, she was Ike sent her to Rome, where she took on the communists and beat the communists down quite a fashion. And we can.
Could you give us a year on that?
Well, it would be mid. I mean, Ike was
1958, 57, something like that.
So I was saying
59.
Mid 50s. Ike would have been 52 to 60.
Yeah, he did 2 terms, didn't he?
Yeah,
56 to
52 to
60 was the
that's
second term.
I think he appointed her because he asked her to join the cabinet as transportation secretary. She turned him down, and then he said, "Well, you know, yeah, it was early mid 50s."
Thank you.
So that was quite a story about how she took on the communists in Italy. Rand, well, what can one say? When we went into the recession in 2008, Americans didn't turn to their Econ 101 textbooks, they turned to Rand's 2 big novels of the 1940s and 50s, which were already selling 100, 200,000 copies a year. Already. You know, 60, 70 years on. Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. Anyway, the figures went up from low 6 figures to high 6 figures. Such was America's desire for an explanation as to what was going on. Rose Friedman, when she was asked by the press in 1976, when Milton Friedman got the Nobel Prize in Economics, how much credit, Rose, do you deserve for Milton's prize? She replied, at least half. And the more I read about Rose, the more I agreed. That was more than, you know, what do they say, behind every great man there's, you know, that was one heck of a collaboration. And that's my last 2, Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs saved New York from becoming Los Angelized, as in, you know, highways destroying neighborhoods. Her Death and Life of Great American Cities is a public policy all-time classic. She totally changed the way people look at cities, and I recently wrote an article about my favorite public policy books of the last 50 years. I listed that as number 2. It's a magnificent piece of literature, all about what makes cities work and what makes them not work. And finally, Dorian Fisher, who was a friend of mine who helped raise lots of money for free market groups all over the world, wrote a manual about setting up an institute, and then left 99% of her considerable fortune for such groups. So what did I learn? Very briefly, I have a chapter in the back where I list 10 things I learned from this study. The first was a complete surprise to me, and that was that I suddenly realised, because I don't think I once touch on temperance in my book. But as when I finished, I realised that all the ladies before, say, 1920 were pro-temperance, and all the ladies of the 1930s were anti. That in fact, the 4 who were alive and could vote in 1932 all did so for FDR. Hating his economics, but they were just so sick and tired of temperance and what it brought to society. And I've not researched this, but my hunch is that the big change between 18 whatever and 1932 was that property rights had changed for women. Something I know people in this country are concerned about. that women had much stronger property rights by 1932 and were much more confident in exercising them, and that the cases that had abounded in the previous century where the woman married the man and all her property became the man's property no longer existed. So if he was drinking it away, there was nothing she could do about it, and now she could. Secondly, nearly all the women in my book who went to school were bored. Isabel Paterson, at age 7, went to school and was asked to read a story about a little red hen when she wanted to discuss William Jennings Bryan and the Silver Question. And she left school with the agreement of her teacher. Clare Luce didn't even go to school till she was 11, and yet at age 8 was reading Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. People like Ayn Rand hid in the back so she could scribble out story ideas, and Jane Jacobs hid in the back so she could read books that were years ahead of the reading level in her school. Upstate New York appeared more often than I ever thought it would. I mean, so many of these, must be something in the water. Upstate New York, because time and again the stories end up there. And likewise the Quakers. I hadn't realised quite the importance of the Quakers and the role they played in American history. And also the surprising number of personal and genealogical connections between these women who I'd chosen for their merits and a good story. And then I'd find out the 4 of them had lunch together in New York, or that 2 of them were cousins, or I find all these connections. Sixth, there's a lot of violence in my book, which should be good for sales. But I came to the conclusion that the mobs who threw stones and eggs and the arsonists who burnt down buildings were not so much concerned, or they weren't concerned at all about the issues of the day, the issues that these women represented. What they were concerned about was the social upheaval that was explicit in women addressing, white women addressing meetings that weren't just made up of other white women. That was okay. The Bible even has passages about how the elder women should teach the younger women. I forget which book, but there's stuff in the Bible about that. And that was okay. But where people got worried was when white men started attending. And then, oh my gosh, you know, black people started attending. And do you know what they called it when a white woman addressed the meeting where there were white men and women and black men and women? It was called promiscuity. That is actually the word that's used in the literature of the time. It is promiscuity for a white woman to address an audience that's mixed sex and mixed race. Seventh, they were a very principled bunch of women. Isabel Paterson was very poor in retirement, but she thought that Social Security was a Ponzi scheme and refused to claim her checks. Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth was walking to Washington to see Lincoln. You know, in those days you walked to Washington to see the president. You know, try doing that today. And Sojourner Truth said to Harriet, she said, "Oh, come with me. Let's go and check this guy Lincoln out. Let's make sure he's the real deal." And Harriet Tubman said, "No," he said, "I'm not going to go see that president as long as he's paying the white regiments twice what he's paying the black regiments. On principle, he's going nowhere near the man until he's paying them equal amounts." They were very strategic in the way they segmented their markets, the way the revolutionists, for example, organised boycotts of British goods and produced homemade goods so they would stop trading with their enemy. There's also a lot of just plain luck at times. I won't give you any examples, but it's just plain serendipity, good luck that comes into a number of the stories. And finally, just incredible amounts of courage. Mercy Otis Warren, for example, was guilty of sedition. I mean, if the Brits had got her, had their hands on her, she'd have been gone before the sun went down. Martha risked her life going and running those winter camps for George. Abigail's letters to her husband when he was at the various conventions contained details of British troop movements in and around Boston, and she could have easily been arrested for spying. The Grimke sisters were mobbed. Harriet Tubman making 10, 15, 20 journeys on the Underground Railroad, where there were bounty hunters waiting at the Pennsylvania-Maryland border to capture these people. The way Sojourner Truth faced down mobs who were throwing eggs. Truth was a huge woman. She was extremely tall and quite broad. She wasn't overweight, she was just a tall lady. And at one public event, a doctor in the audience had collected about $40 worth, and that would probably be about $1,000 in today's money, of bets that she wasn't a woman, she was a man. And this is all a complete masquerade. And so he challenged her. And he said that he asked, would some of the white women volunteer to go behind the stage and take Truth backstage and check out her chest and then come back with a report. Well, you can imagine how keen these white women were back in whenever this was, 1860 or something, the thought of doing this. But before they could go any further, Truth took on the doctor and bared her chest to the entire audience, and proving quite decisively that she was a woman. Harriet Beecher Stowe's hate mail with the body parts cut off slaves. Cady Stanton and Bina and C.J. Walker travelling, all three of them, right across America on their own, at times when women travelling alone would have been quite rare. Childhoods of some of these women were extraordinary, and so on. Ayn Rand and Rose Friedman both escaped Russia, for example. Jane Jacobs fought huge vested interest in New York City and was arrested. And the think tanks that Dorian has supported, at least two of which, one in Vancouver and one in Lima, Peru, were bombed. So the book is full of a phenomenal amount of courage and determination. And I hope you all read it. I know several of you have bought it. Those of you who haven't bought it, it's still for sale. And I'd be happy to take any questions either about my book, Ladies for Liberty, or my Margaret Thatcher book, or the Margaret Thatcher movie. Assuming has anybody seen the Margaret Thatcher movie? There's a few heads, about half of you, I think. Thank you.
Very good.
Well, it falls to me to Dr. Blundell, may I call you John, to
Please.
formally to thank you. John, I think the subject, Ladies for Liberty, Women Who Made a Difference in America, I mean, it's just such a magnificent, huge, wide-ranging subject, which you said early on that not many people knew about this, not many people knew some of these names, and you really educated us, I think, extremely well. I mean, the thing is, just the things I've noted, you said they were all pro-liberty, they all had an enduring influence, they were all Quakers, a lot of Quaker influence, some of them were pro and some anti-temperance, and also were interested in property rights. I must say the first one, Martha Washington, I thought was rather interesting, the fact that she might have changed the course of American history if she hadn't gone and supported him in that winter camp. But the other ones, I think for us, I mean there were so many, but for us in the Nassau Institute, Ayn Rand and the two big novels you mentioned, but most of all Milton Friedman's wife, because you may not know, but we have, with permission, one of our rooms in the Nassau Institute premises is called the Milton Friedman room. So we're very much in favour of that and interested in what you had to say. So thank you very much. It was illuminating, interesting, extremely wide-ranging, and I think I can say on behalf of everybody here, and also in particular my fellow directors of the Nassau Institute, would you come back, John? You only live in Tampa. Could you come and tell us a bit more about Margaret Thatcher or any other subjects? But thank you very much indeed.